All right, Crim 28, here we go. We are going to start off with Chapter 1. There's no number 1 on here. But this is Chapter 1, Community-Based Corrections. So let's go on to the next slide. So Chapter 1, there we go. Now it says Chapter 1. An overview of community corrections goals and evidence-based practices, learning objectives. This is what this chapter will teach you. What is corrections? What is its purpose? What's the role of corrections at each of the 3 main decision points? We're going to talk about all this, of course. Analyze the theories behind the correctional goals and punishment and rehabilitation, and explain the importance of evidence-based practices. Doesn't this sound awesome? I'm just saying. Okay, I'm being a little sarcastic. I think Chapter 1 might be a little bit boring. So it starts with, this is a pretty daunting number when we think about this. Approximately 7 million people, about 3% of our entire population in the United States, are under some form of correctional supervision. Crazy, huh? So if you're in a classroom full of 100 students, it's very likely that at least 3 of them are on probation, parole, some sort of correctional supervision. Community corrections is it's been around for a long time, but it's becoming much more and more common now because, well, we're going to talk about why, but for many reasons, rehabilitating offenders in the community does have some pros and some cons. But if you think about it, let's say an offender got a DUI and hurt somebody. Well, not dead, but hurt somebody. This was the offender's first DUI. They're gainfully employed. They've never been arrested before. They have 4 children at home. Besides that one horrible decision they made that one night when they got behind the wheel under the influence of alcohol, they haven't ever done anything even remotely against the law. That might be a person that would be better off staying in the community as long as they don't drink and drive than being incarcerated. If he gets incarcerated, who's going to pay his bills? Who's going to support his family? What about the bond and the relationship between him and his children? Again, assuming this is a good guy. And how much is his life impacted then? How will he ever recover if he goes to prison and gets out? So I'm not saying that people shouldn't go to prison, but there are some circumstances where community corrections is more ideal. So sometimes people are released from jail pending court proceedings, and they can be supervised by a probation officer. Sometimes people pending sentencing are still supervised, it's kind of like a bail type situation, except there's no money involved. People are placed on house arrest, things like that. Post-adjudication or pre-adjudication, so after their trial has been resolved or before. What is probation? I hope you guys know this, but I'm going to go back. So probation, this is basically it is a sentence that is imposed by a judge. A judge will tell an offender, I'm going to put you in prison for 3 years, but I'm going to stay that or hold off on that order, and I'm going to allow you to live in the community under certain terms and conditions. So probation is an order by a judge, and the offender is then typically supervised by a county probation officer. And again, this is what I did. So probation and parole are very similar but very different, and we're going to obviously get into that throughout this class, but that's what probation is. Indeterminate sentencing. So let me give you an example of indeterminate sentencing. A sentence of 25 years to life is indeterminate. Now, I can kind of remind myself the difference between determinate and indeterminate by saying the end has not been determined. It is undetermined, so it is indeterminate sentencing. The offender would have to do at least 25 years. But we wouldn't know the release date. We would not know when that sentence absolutely positively had to be over. The concept of that was give an open-ended date for release, and offenders will behave better in custody. It was supposed to be kind of the carrot to dangle out to encourage offenders to participate in the programs while they were in custody, work the programs, benefit from the programs, and get out. Is that how it works? Not necessarily. Most offenders, I mean, if you don't want to change, you're not going to change. But that was kind of the concept. The judges would decide who went to prison, and then the parole boards would decide when the person was rehabilitated. You can imagine this also caused issues because people were biased. If you had a parole board member, let's say, that was racist, then he's probably more likely to let someone of a certain race or ethnicity out earlier than he would another. So there was a lot of room for discretion, which was good and bad in some instances. So that's still part of the whole indeterminate sentencing. Discretionary parole was used as a release strategy. And again, the whole purpose was to encourage the offenders to do well while they were in custody. Determinate sentencing is kind of the exact opposite of indeterminate sentencing. Ultimately, an example would be if you were committed to prison for 3 to 5 years. You know 100% that you will not be there longer than 5 years. The end date has been determined. Determinate sentencing. Now, could you get out earlier? Yeah, but the concept of fairness became an issue, like I said, because there were biases and discretion and people not being particularly fair with the indeterminate releases, so determinate sentencing came about. But think about this. Let's say I am a 25-year-old Army wife. We have 3 children. I had triplets, let's say. I had triplets, and my husband is away at war, and the federal government shuts down and stops paying him. Okay? My kids are 2. They're 2. I go to Walmart and I steal $1,000 worth of baby formula because my kids are going to starve. All right. It's a felony. Versus I am a drug addict and my drug dealer boyfriend needs to buy some guns, so I go into Walmart and steal $1,000 worth of baby formula for him to sell and buy more guns. That's the exact same offense. Can you imagine that fairness and equality is sometimes a good thing and sometimes not? Should the Army wife who committed the exact same offense as the drug addict? Probably not. Anyways, we'll keep moving here. There are things called mandatory minimum sentences, where if you commit certain offenses, you have to be sentenced to a certain period of time by law. Judges lose discretion at that point. Truth in sentencing is something that's used by the federal government when they do sentencing. Truth in sentencing means that the offender will be in custody for 80 to 85% of the time that they are ordered by the courts. Let me explain this a little bit further. In California, if you are sent to prison for 10 years, the likelihood is very good that you will be out in about 3.5. They do about 30%-ish, typically. Now, if you were sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, you're going to stay in for at least 8, if not 8.5. Truth in sentencing, that's what it is. And, side note, there is no such thing as federal parole anymore. I know, crazy, huh? They didn't need it because they were keeping their offenders in longer. And they still do, by the way. 3 strikes. You're probably familiar with this. 3 strikes and you're out. 3 strikes laws were based out of a case that happened in Fresno, actually, in the probably 1990s. A young girl named Kimber Reynolds was shot and killed in the Tower District. She was going over to Livingstone's with her friends to have dinner. The man who shot and killed her had been in and out of prison numerous times for other serious offenses. So her dad, John Reynolds, reached out to the local assemblyman, and they wrote up 3 strikes. So that's how 3 strikes came about. 3 strikes ultimately means that you can commit 2 serious violent felonies and then a 3rd felony of any sort and be in prison for the rest of your life. Serious violent felonies are things like armed robbery, drive-by shootings, offenses where people were typically hurt bad. So 3 strikes is still in effect, sort of. And there are a lot of sentencing guidelines. There was a case out of Northern California a couple years ago. You probably heard about this. It was a Stanford student who was a swimmer, and he raped a young lady in an alley behind a garbage dumpster at a bar. The judge in that case, after there was a conviction for a felony rape, sentenced the offender to 90 days in jail because he did not want, I think he said, 2 minutes of pleasure to ruin the rest of the swimmer's life. Yes, I am saying that right, I think. So, why do we have sentencing guidelines? Because judges do really bad things like that sometimes. So that guy ultimately raped another college student and spent 30 days in jail. Ultimately. Crazy. Corrections is expensive, especially being in custody. What does the public think about community corrections, and does it matter? Of course it does. If the public doesn't like the way things are going with probation or parole, they're going to complain to the local politicians and try and get things changed. And prison is expensive. There are instances where it costs over $70,000 a year to hold an inmate in custody. $70,000 a year is the tuition, or maybe 75 now, tuition for Stanford University. So consider that. Each offender we're spending $70,000 a year on. It's a lot of money. A lot of money. A lot of money. So there are a lot of times where corrections agencies get involved throughout the court system. One of those is during bail. In California specifically, we had a law that was signed where bail was going to be done away with altogether. Bail was going to be abolished. But that was supposed to go into effect, gosh, I think October of 2018. But now it's hung up in the court system. But sometimes offenders can, even if they can't afford the bail, can be released under the supervision of the probation officer. So that is one of the points, and probation officers are corrections, are part of the corrections world. So that's how they sometimes get involved in the bail decisions. Probation officers write sentencing reports for every felony, adult felony sentencing hearing. So they're involved in that decision as well. And then reentry, parole makes a decision as to whether or not someone is going to be released back into the community, typically. Sometimes probation would be involved if they're getting released from jail. So they are involved in a lot more, a lot of different things. Pretrial supervision. We also can't afford to and don't have room to house everybody in the Fresno County Jail. Everybody who is awaiting trial, right? Makes sense, right? The jail is full. So some people, based on their risk to reoffend, are released pending their trial. The probation officer has to be able to know where the offender is. It also helps the offender to prepare for his case, allows the offender defendant to keep on working, and then keeps bed space open in jail for defendants who are not released. So ultimately, most offenders can be punished / rehabilitated in the community, and most honestly are. Intermediate sanctions are programs where people can be in custody or in a residential treatment program, so they gradually get more and more freedom. You've probably heard this before. Maybe offenders go to prison. When they immediately get released from prison, they go to something called a halfway house. They kind of take those graduated steps back into the community so that their freedom, they don't get as overwhelmed, and they kind of take baby steps back into freedom. This also gives judges a lot of more options at the time of sentencing. Reentry. When we're talking about reentry, we're talking about an offender being released from custody back into the community. Okay, so it's really frustrating. I have I'm doing air quotes when I say a friend who was a murderer / lifer, and I had him in a class, and which was really interesting. So then I got to kind of pick his brain about the whole reentry process. I would say he got released probably 2011, 12, something like that, after doing about 23 years in prison. And he said early on when he was in prison in probably the 80s and 90s, maybe the 90s, offenders who were going to get released back into the community were receiving 3 months worth of reentry services. So they would go to a different prison, a different facility, and they were offered all these services to try to make their return to the community more smooth. They would find them a place to live. They would follow up on getting them mental health services in their area if they needed it. They would try and get them a job. They would try to introduce them to their parole agent, all this kind of stuff. So they did all this stuff to try to help the offenders be more successful when they got out. When my friend, air quotes again, got out of prison, he got 8 hours of reentry services. 8 hours. He was in custody for 23 years. 8 hours of reentry services. So those reentry services, for those who don't have a supportive family on the outs, are immense. They're really a really big deal. So some agencies do have pre-release programs. Some don't. And parole is another kind of a graduated release from prison. Parole is granted by a parole board, not by a judge. A judge has nothing to do with parole. And the parole board will ultimately review the offender's, the nature of the offense, what the offender's done since they've been in prison, like how they performed in prison, and their risk to reoffend. And they make the decision as to whether or not that person should get released on parole. And I can tell you again, my lifer friend Brian went to the parole board probably 6 or 7 times before he was finally paroled. It's not common for a lifer to get paroled, so he was kind of an interesting one. So, what else? Theories behind community corrections goals: protect the public through deterrence, rehabilitate. I'm trying to get back to that last. There we go. Okay. So theories behind community corrections goals: protecting the public through deterrence, rehabilitation, healing the victim and community through restorative justice, and the integrated theory of community supervision, the participation process model. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? Evidence-based practices. So ultimately, when I started with the probation department, probably 20-something years ago, probation officers were given their stack of cases, and it was basically up to the probation officer to decide how they were going to rehabilitate that offender. How many times a day a week, a month, a year I was going to see that offender, what kind of programs I was going to offer that offender, and how much supervision that I was going to give that offender in general. Probation officers got to basically make that decision. without any information other than the information that we have in the file. So now what we have to do is when you get a new case, you would go through this kind of, what do you call it, a tool to evaluate what type of services that offender could benefit from. And the tool was basically just a survey on a computer. And then, click some buttons on a computer, hit enter, answer some questions, and then the computer will tell you how many times a day, week, month, year that you should see that offender and what type of services. So it was kind of a big change, but it's important that instead of just using kind of your gut instinct, actually followed what the evidence proved through studies and research proved was effective. So it was really hard to change to that, I will admit. And I think that's it.